各位同事，大家好. Pleasure to be here. Thank you, Long. So what I want to talk about is a couple of things that reflect upon the last day and some of the talks that we've heard, and then start to think through really the broader implications for AI and theories of the firm, and we'll add platform ecosystems and platform models as part of that. So I'll start with two types of costs that we've been hearing about. One is a reduction, and I'd say that's the majority of what we've been talking about over the last day. But I'd also like to talk a little bit about the potential for increase, and we'll use a simulation environment to talk about that, because now we've just had it introduced in the Harry Potter verse, so I appreciate that. So first, let's talk about reduction. I've been interested in business-to-business and industrial and manufacturing systems really for my whole career, but then most recently in the platform context, because much of what we learned really came out of a business-to-consumer context. And so I feel like it's incumbent on us to really understand some of the complexities that more kind of logistics, manufacturing, kind of incumbent firms are facing. And so I'm going to focus just on one because I'd spent a lot of time on this topic, and we only have about 20 minutes. So one of the interesting areas when you have any kind of B2B platform technology is it always lands in a complex environment. And so if you look here, we just sorted the data from 200 structured interviews that we did in addition to about 400 examples to build out archetypes. And in automotive technology manufacturing, there's always a significant upfront integration cost, less so in retail and wholesale. And so what ends up being interesting in this context is you end up arguing over who pays for that integration cost. And so frequently, the platform provider, think the technology provider, ends up absorbing those costs and then figuring out some sort of a business model that allows them to recoup the cost over time. So cost is a really significant impact on the speed and the scale of the potential deployments, and it also ends up causing a lot of fragmentation by industry. So if we then go and think, well, what's been happening in the last couple of years? So of course, we're talking about AI. Pretty much every conference I go to now, we talk about AI. Doesn't matter what the top level is, because it's been such a transformational impact over the last few years. So to give two specific examples, I was on the World Economic Forum Global Future Council for Advanced Manufacturing. That is a mouthful. But the good news is that I was able to meet a couple of really interesting CEOs. One is John Sobel, CEO of Sight Machine. The other is Natan, CEO of Tulip. They've both attacked a similar problem. So what I like about what John's company, Sight Machine, did was they've been toiling for about 12 years trying to integrate complex industrial equipment. And so more recently, what they've done is use generative AI that reduces the cost significantly, because about a third of the information flows in that system were essentially untagged and difficult to understand. So once you can tag them, you can structure them, then you can apply our standard statistical techniques for quality improvement, cost reductions, all the things that you would expect these systems to be able to do. Tulip does something relatively similar, where they're querying documents, extracting content, and again, organizing complex information. So these stories both fit the story of human labor reduction that we've heard over, like the CEO of Lipin sort of saying, hey, all the CEOs are saying, how do we get rid of the people? This is a story that's very consistent with that. So now I want to move to the middle and tell a slightly different story. It's one of unintended consequences. And so here, we've been looking at AI accelerated coding and some of the trade-offs that you might end up facing. So I'll just read this out. So Mark Zuckerberg, 2025, says, hey, we're working on this, and we're going to have AI that will kind of be the equivalent of a mid-level engineer in the coding capability. And so organizations, as we've been hearing, are anticipating major gains in productivity, OpenAI 4.1, oriented to coding, and some of the early evidence actually supports this enthusiasm. So GitHub, McKinsey are saying, yeah, we're seeing this. Okay, so now let's talk to some of the people that are actually doing this. So our respondents are coming out of sort of the GAFAM, they're coming out of some of the big healthcare companies, major automotive firms, so really big firms. Talking to the CIOs, talking to some of the senior developers. Okay, so here's one unit. I have 50 gigabytes of AI-generated code in our area that, for the English speakers, I insert expletive here, you can do nothing with. And so the challenge is that some of those studies are conducted in controlled environments. That's not the same, and that was the whole reason to mention B2B as landing systems in existing, what we'll call brownfield or incumbent environments. That's a lot more complex. And so why the difference? A lot of it is around technical debt. So most software, especially in industrial settings, incumbent companies, have to land on top of existing systems. And so technical debt is sort of the downside. It's when you cut corners, you go fast, you build on top of legacy, you don't necessarily know what the dependencies are. And so here are some verbatims. Redundant code from cut and paste makes it hard to change. Say you have male, female, then other. Now all of a sudden I've got, thousands of lines of things. So the problem with AI is you can't necessarily see the bigger picture. Lots of problems, difficult to catch. I like this bottom one. I don't think I've seen such an increase in technical debt in 35 years of being in this industry. Okay, so what we did is we built out a simulation model, 2 stocks, services, those are things that are good, they make you money. Technical debt, those are things that are bad. They slow you down, they stop you from building services. And so what we ended up doing was saying, hey, what if you use a lot of AI? That ends up being really great, but in the long run can accelerate and turbocharge tech debt. Past a point, it ends up hurting. And so the over-reliance in some ways of AI should be thought of carefully. So here's the challenge. With AI, a junior engineer can write as fast as a senior engineer, but they don't necessarily know what they're doing, what problems they're solving, or rather causing, or even if it's a good idea. So if we break it out then by high skill and low skill engineers, we say, well, the high skill, they actually can use the AI because they have some sense of what the environment is and what the downsides are. The low skill keeps up at first, but only at first. Then if we break it out by brownfield versus greenfield, so by greenfield, I mean, think of a startup, think of something new where there's no existing system that you need to integrate to. That is explicitly not the typical B2B environment. So there, you get the typical better and then worse, but at least it doesn't crush you. In a brownfield environment, you can easily get the better before worse, and then long run worse, as opposed to simply not relying on the AI to begin with. Now, granted, our colleagues in the AI space are working on all of this. So this story could be really different in 3 to 5 years. But right now, I'd say there's a cautionary tale. So implications, code assistants are here, they have value, but you got to be thoughtful about the deployment. And so there's still a role there for sort of your senior engineering tech leads. Okay, so with that, I want to just flip to what does that have to do with firms? Okay, so when we think about firms, this is some work with colleagues, Bo. She's one of my postdocs, Marshall, many of you know, and me. So we've got a few views. transaction cost economics, agency theory, incomplete contracts, resource-based view, and then there's been so much ferment in the platform and ecosystem literature, and since we've been part of that, we're putting that in as one of the theories that will have some impact in this space. Okay, so lots of references, let's just zero in. Firm definition, governance structure, nexus of contracts, bundle of capabilities. These are things we all learned, at least if you were sort of going through management and economics. Boundaries, do you make, do you buy? And a lot of this has a cost structure implication. Agency costs or transaction costs. Org structure, what aligns interests and incentives? And then in case of the platform theory, we think of how value can essentially be created outside of a firm, and then the platform itself orchestrates those ecosystems and value creation. And then in terms of sort of the strategic advantages, think about Bencht's work in resource-based view of the firm. It comes from firm-specific assets that are scarce, inevitable, hard to copy. In platform world, it's network effects, user bases, and increasingly data, especially hard to replicate unique data. And then in terms of firm boundaries, let's talk now about what the AI does. Well, if coordination costs fall more than production costs, then we move toward a market. And then in a typical if-then, else, we move toward inside firm. So really straightforward, testable hypotheses. Now, and I say testable hypotheses because we don't really know where this is going. This is as much a call to action for our empirical colleagues as anything else. Similarly, if AI automates decisions, then smaller firm. I think I counted 3 or 4 or 5 slides yesterday that talked about lots of people, a few people, down to perhaps one person. And so that's consistent, in terms of decision making. If AI reduces information asymmetry, agency costs fall. If AI becomes harder to monitor, and there is some evidence that the AI will start to learn what you might punish it for, and then hide that behavior. And so then agency costs rise. And I think this last one is really important, which is, think about the AI risks. So here we have the deep fakes, we've got misinformation. If those increase, then the platform governance structure, which can monitor these things, becomes even more important. And then finally, in terms of strategy, if the Gen AI itself becomes the more valuable asset, then we expect rents to shift toward your OpenAI and other generative AI firms. But if the competitive advantage is only obtained through, say, customized AI, now we'll think about the data asset. Then the rents will shift toward those with proprietary data, and those should, and we would predict, outperform those without such data. So to close it out, I've got a very close colleague who's in the management literature and a strategy professor, and he talked about sort of the battles of the field through things like related diversification and sort of decades spent. And we hashed this through, and he's like, look, we badly need new theories of the firm that take into account these technologies. So with that, thank you very much.